What kind of world sells a woman for a sack of grain? And what kind of courage does it take to survive it? Dust Creek, Texas, baked beneath a merciless sun that had long forgotten mercy. The year was 1884, and the drought had stretched on so long that even the riverbeds had turned to dust. Crops withered before they ever broke soil. Cattle died with tongues swollen from thirst, and hope had become a currency few could afford. The wind carried the smell of scorched earth through town. But today, something fouler lingered in the air. Desperation mixed with spectacle. The townsfolk gathered in the square, their faces carved with hunger and dust, their eyes hollow. Men, women, even children pressed in close to watch as a woman was brought to the platform. Her wrists were bound in front of her, her once white dress stained brown by travel and neglect. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and once, not long ago, she had been a woman of grace, educated proper. The kind who had read books by lamplight and written letters on fine paper. But the world had changed. Hardship had stripped her of gentility, and now she stood in the heart of Dust Creek being auctioned like livestock. The town sheriff, whose badge was dulled from disuse, raised his voice over the murmuring crowd. "What'll you give for her? A worker, quiet, no trouble. The lady's fallen on hard times, can read and write too." A murmur rolled through the crowd. Reading and writing were luxuries out here. Someone called out, "2 sacks of flour." Another, "1 hog, half grown." Laughter followed, the kind that carried no humor. Then a wiry man stepped forward, sunburned and lean, holding up a burlap sack. "I'll give 1 sack of grain, good wheat too." The crowd hushed. In a place where food was life, a sack of grain was worth more than pride, more than decency, more than the humanity of a woman. Clara's jaw tightened. Though her eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. "You can't do this," she said, her voice hoarse but clear. "I am not property." The sheriff didn't look at her. "You owe the town, Miss Whitmore. Folks took you in, fed you, and debts have to be paid. It's this or the road." The road. Alone. Hungry. Unarmed. She swallowed hard, lifting her chin, defiance her only armor. From the edge of the crowd, a man dismounted a chestnut horse. James Callahan wasn't a man who drew attention. He was quiet, his hat pulled low, his clothes dusted from the trail. But his eyes, gray as rain that never came, cut through the scene like a blade. He'd seen enough of the world's cruelty to recognize the shape of it when it stood before him. As the sheriff started to drop the gavel, James's voice broke through. "Wait." Every head turned. Even Clara froze. James stepped closer, each boot heel sinking into the dry earth. "I'll match the bid," he said, his tone calm but weighted. 1 sack of grain." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. The sheriff's brow furrowed. "You sure, Callahan? You've got no wife, no help at your place." "I don't need help," he replied. "Just making sure this doesn't turn uglier than it already is." Clara's eyes snapped toward him, disbelief and anger flashing. "I don't need your charity," she hissed, but her voice shook more than she wanted it to. James didn't answer her. He didn't look for gratitude. He just nodded to the sheriff, handed over the sack, and cut the ropes around Clara's wrists. The rough hemp fell away, leaving red welts on her pale skin. For a long, tense moment, the two of them stood in the middle of that square. One man, one woman, both marked by something heavier than circumstance. "Come on," he said quietly. "You're free to go. But if you've got nowhere else, I can offer a roof till you figure it out." The crowd started to disperse, muttering. No one liked seeing decency win. It made their own compromises feel heavier. Clara stared at the hand he extended. She didn't take it. Instead, she walked past him toward his horse, her back straight, every step a declaration that she'd been humiliated enough for one lifetime. The road from Dust Creek stretched long and empty. The sun was sinking low, bleeding orange across the cracked horizon. They rode in silence, the air thick with dust and things unsaid. Clara's wrists still throbbed, her pride even more so. She kept her gaze forward, refusing to meet his eyes. "Why'd you do it?" she finally asked, her tone clipped. James didn't answer right away. His hands rested steady on the reins, eyes on the road. "Because someone should have," he said simply, "and no one else was going to. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." His voice was low, rough like gravel under boots, and something in it made her chest tighten. Not pity, not tenderness, something else. A man who had seen enough wrongs to know one when he saw it. They rode until the last light faded, until the dry grass gave way to the faint outline of a ranch house in the distance. A lantern burned on the porch, warm against the encroaching dark. "You can rest here tonight," he said, dismounting. "Belongs to the Hales. Good folks." Clara slid from the saddle awkwardly, her legs trembling from exhaustion. "And you?" "I work here," James said. "Been a few years now." He led her toward the porch where an older woman with kind eyes, Margaret Hale, waited, wiping her hands on her apron. "Lord have mercy, James," she said softly. "What have you brought home this time?" James took off his hat, looking almost sheepish. "Someone who could use a place for the night." Margaret's gaze softened as it landed on Clara. Without a word, she opened the door wider. "Come on in, dear, supper's still warm." For the first time all day, Clara hesitated, not from fear but from disbelief, at the offer of kindness simple and undeserved. Inside, the fire crackled, the smell of bread and stew filling the air. She hadn't eaten a real meal in days. As she sat down, her body trembled, not from hunger but from the sudden realization that she might finally be safe. Across the table, James sat quietly, his expression unreadable in the flicker of firelight. The lines of his face were worn by sun and sorrow, his eyes shadowed by something heavier than regret. Clara looked at him, at the man who'd bought her freedom for a sack of grain, and felt a shiver run through her that had nothing to do with the night's chill. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man running from something he could never quite escape. And in that flickering moment between silence and words, Clara understood something unsettling. The man who had just saved her life looked as though he was still trying to save his own. Sometimes mercy is the heaviest burden a man can carry. The morning after the auction broke over Hale Ranch with the faint blush of dawn, soft light spilling across the rugged hills of West Texas. A thin layer of dust shimmered in the air, stirred by the restless hooves of horses and the early clang of tools from the barn. Inside the small ranch house, the scent of coffee and fresh biscuits rose from the kitchen, mingling with the quiet hum of voices. But in one of the small back rooms, Clara Whitmore sat by the window, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug, her eyes distant and wary. She hadn't slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, the crowd from Dust Creek flashed behind her lids, jeering faces, the sheriff's indifference, the rough tug of rope around her wrists. She thought herself numb to shame after all that had happened. But the memory still burned, and worse than the humiliation was the question that haunted her. Why had he done it? Outside, she could see James Callahan working near the corral. The man moved with quiet efficiency, every action deliberate, like someone used to living inside his own head. He didn't smile, didn't speak unless spoken to, but there was something about his presence that drew the eye. Even now, as he saddled a horse, the morning light caught the faint scar that ran along his jawline, a pale reminder of a life that hadn't been gentle. James carried his past like a shadow that never quite left his side. Years ago, he'd ridden with a crew that didn't care much for right or wrong, only for survival. They'd taken jobs that blurred the line between the two, guarding freight for a corrupt merchant, running off settlers from land that wasn't theirs. He'd been younger then, angrier, convinced that decency didn't feed a man or keep him alive, until one day in New Mexico when a standoff went wrong. A man had begged for mercy. James hadn't fired, but he hadn't stopped his partners either. The memory of that helpless, pleading face had stayed with him ever since, a ghost that whispered every time he looked in the mirror. That's what made him step forward in Dust Creek. He'd seen that same helplessness in Clara's eyes, the kind that no human being should ever have to wear. Saving her hadn't been gallantry. It had been penance. "Coffee's still hot," Margaret Hale said, stepping into the room. She was a woman in her late 50s, her gray-streaked hair pinned back neatly, her eyes soft but sharp as needles when they needed to be. She set a fresh cup on the table before Clara and gave her a knowing look. "You don't have to keep staring out that window, dear. The man's not going anywhere." Clara blinked, caught off guard. "I wasn't—" Margaret smiled faintly. "Of course you weren't." She poured herself a cup and sat opposite her guest. "He doesn't talk much, that one. But I've known James near 6 years. He's got more good in him than most men twice as loud." Clara hesitated, unsure how to respond. "He bought me," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "Whatever his intentions, that's what happened. I'm here because of a transaction." Margaret shook her head. "You're here because he couldn't stand to see the world turn uglier than it already is." She reached across the table and placed a gentle hand over Clara's. "He didn't buy you, child. He freed you." The words landed softly but unsettled her all the same. Freedom was something Clara had stopped believing in months ago. Out here, everyone was bound to something: land, debt, or hunger. Still, Margaret's tone carried no pity, only truth. By midday, Clara had ventured outside. The dry wind tugged at her skirt as she walked toward the barn, where James was hammering nails into a fence post. He paused when he saw her, wiping sweat from his brow. "You need something?" he asked. "I need answers," she said bluntly. "Why me?" He studied her for a long moment, eyes narrowing slightly as though weighing his words. "Didn't figure anyone else would," he said finally. "You looked like you'd already been through enough." Her laugh was bitter. "So this is charity, then? Another wounded stray for you to mend?" James set down the hammer, his expression unreadable. "No," he said, "it's just what's right." She crossed her arms, defiance flaring. "And what do you expect in return?" He looked at her then, really looked, and something flickered behind his eyes, a mixture of hurt and understanding. "Nothing. You're free to go whenever you wish." The simplicity of it disarmed her more than anger could have. He didn't argue, didn't try to convince her of his virtue. He simply gave her back what the world had taken: choice. But Clara had lived too long on the edge of other people's mercy to trust in selflessness. That night she sat awake in the small room Margaret had offered her, listening to the low hum of crickets outside. Every kindness in her life had come with strings. She couldn't decide if this quiet cowboy was honest or dangerous in a different way. The longer she stayed, the more uncertain she felt about what he wanted from her, or if he even knew himself. The next few days passed in a cautious rhythm. Clara helped Margaret with household chores, cleaned, cooked, and tried not to feel like a ghost haunting someone else's life. James worked from dawn to dusk, mending fences, training horses, fixing the roof when the wind tore a shingle loose. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice carried an unintentional gentleness that made her heart ache against her will. One afternoon, as the sun slipped low, Clara found herself watching him work again, hammering in the fading light. Margaret joined her on the porch, knitting needles clicking softly. "You can trust him, you know," she said without looking up. Clara stiffened. "I don't trust anyone." Margaret's hands paused, her eyes lifting. "Then maybe that's what the good Lord brought you here to learn." That night, Clara packed her small bag. She told herself she couldn't stay where she didn't belong, couldn't live on borrowed kindness. She crept quietly through the house, the floorboards creaking beneath her boots. Outside, the night was heavy and still, the moon laying silver over the dry fields. Her heart pounded as she crossed the yard toward the main gate. James stood there already, leaning against the fence post as if he'd been expecting her. His hat shadowed his face, but his voice came low and steady. "You leaving?" Clara froze. "I don't belong here." He nodded slowly. "Maybe not yet. But running won't fix what's broken." "Then what will?" she asked, her voice trembling despite herself. He stepped closer, stopping just short of touching her. "Facing it." His gaze met hers, unflinching. "You think you're the only one trying to make peace with the past?" Something in his tone, raw, honest, stripped of pretense, sent a shiver through her. The man who had rescued her wasn't the savior she'd imagined. He was just another soul trying to crawl his way out of the wreckage of his own mistakes. Behind him, the ranch stretched wide and endless beneath the starlight. For the first time, Clara realized this place wasn't just her refuge, it was his redemption. And as she stood there at the gate, her bag heavy in her hand and her heart heavier still, she began to understand the truth that James Callahan had carried in silence all along. He hadn't saved her because she needed saving. He'd done it because he did. Can purpose grow in the same soil that once buried your hope? For weeks, Clara Whitmore had believed she was little more than the sum of her mistakes, a woman without a future living on borrowed mercy. But something in James Callahan's steady silence and Margaret Hale's gentle kindness had begun to loosen the knot of fear that lived in her chest. The morning after she almost left, she woke to the soft hum of the ranch stirring to life and realized she couldn't run again. She owed them something, more than labor, more than gratitude. She owed herself proof that she could still build. By late spring, the Texas sun had bleached the earth pale, but in the corner of the ranch yard stood an old bunkhouse too small for sleeping and too sturdy to tear down. That was where Clara found her chance. She spent 3 days sweeping out dust thick as memory, patching the cracks in the walls and scrubbing the windows until light could slip through again. She'd been a teacher before her world crumbled. Teaching was the only thing she knew that could turn despair into something useful. When she mentioned her idea at supper, Margaret set down her fork, eyes shining. "A schoolhouse," she repeated softly. "For the children?" Clara nodded, hesitant. "There's no formal school for miles. I could teach the ranch hands' children, reading, numbers, a bit of history. Maybe. It's a way to repay everything you've done." Margaret's husband, Thomas Hale, gave a slow, approving nod. "Education's worth more than gold out here. You do it, Miss Whitmore. We'll help however we can." James didn't speak at first. He only studied her from across the table, then gave one of his small, almost imperceptible nods. "You'll need desks. I'll build them." That was how it began. Within a week, Clara's world took on a new rhythm. She rose before dawn, her fingers smudged with chalk dust instead of shame. The children arrived shyly at first, 5 at the beginning, then 8, then 12. They came barefoot and sunburned, carrying slates so worn she could see through them. Clara taught them letters by drawing in the dirt when chalk ran short, and she told them stories between lessons, tales of bravery and hope that felt half like lessons and half like prayers. James worked nearby, mending fences or repairing saddles, but more and more often she found him outside the schoolhouse, hammering together rough benches and tables. He never said much, but he always seemed to finish the things she needed before she asked. When one of the boys broke a slate in half, a new one appeared the next morning. When the door latch jammed, it was fixed by dawn. She began to notice small things about him, the way he tipped his hat to her students when they passed, how he listened more than he spoke, how he seemed to carry the weight of a man making up for years he couldn't erase. By midsummer, the one-room schoolhouse had become more than a building. It was a sanctuary. Men from neighboring ranches stopped by on Sundays, curious about the teacher who came from ruin, as the whispers in Dust Creek had started to call her. Clara ignored the gossip. Every word written by a child's hand, every smile earned from a student who had never held a book before, that was her redemption. Evenings often found her cleaning the room alone, the golden light of sunset spilling across the rough floorboards. Sometimes she would pause, looking out at the fields, watching James work in the distance. There was comfort in the silence between them, a wordless understanding that both were building something larger than themselves. One afternoon, a storm threatened from the horizon. Thunder rolled low across the prairie as Clara gathered her students close and told them about the water cycle, explaining that sometimes the sky had to break open for the land to live again. As the first drops of rain began to fall, the children gasped and ran outside, spinning in delight. Clara laughed, truly laughed. For the first time in months, her hair plastered to her cheeks as the rain washed away the dust. James stood under the awning watching. When she turned toward him, he didn't look away. There was pride in his eyes, soft, quiet pride that said more than words ever could. For a heartbeat, she forgot to breathe. That night, after the storm passed and the children had gone home, she lingered in the schoolhouse. The air smelled of damp wood and renewal. She struck a match and lit a candle, setting it on the desk to mark the first day of something she wanted to remember. The flame flickered, steady and alive, casting long shadows on the walls. Her hand brushed over the papers on her desk, drawings, lessons, the beginnings of hope stitched together in chalk and ink. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by what had been taken from her, but by what she was giving back. Behind her, the door creaked. She turned, startled, the light from the candle trembling across the room. James stood in the doorway, rain still dripping from the brim of his hat. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were darker than she'd ever seen them. "You shouldn't be out in this weather," she said softly, instinctively reaching for the shawl draped across a chair. He didn't move. "I was out checking the east pasture," he said, his voice low, almost distracted. "Saw the candle through the window, thought—" He stopped himself, taking a slow breath. "Thought what?" Clara asked, her pulse quickening, though she couldn't have said why. He stepped closer, the floor creaking beneath his boots. "Thought I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time." "What's that?" "Light," he said simply. "Real light, the kind that means something." For a long moment they stood there, two people who'd both learned to live in shadow, watching the small flame dance between them. Then James's face shifted, the faint warmth replaced by something heavier. His jaw tightened, his shoulders tensed. Clara's heart sank. Whatever peace she'd seen in him a moment ago was gone, replaced by that same haunted look she'd glimpsed the night of the auction. "James," she whispered. "What is it?" He looked at her, and for an instant she thought he might finally tell her the truth about the weight he carried. But instead he just tipped his hat, eyes shadowed by regret. "You ought to get some rest, Miss Whitmore. Long day tomorrow." He turned to leave, but the flicker of the candle caught the moisture in his eyes, and for the briefest heartbeat, Clara saw the truth she hadn't dared name before. This man, for all his quiet strength, was still bleeding from wounds he didn't know how to heal. She stood alone in the doorway after he left, the candle burning low, the night pressing close. Outside, thunder rumbled again in the distance. Not angry this time, but mournful, like the sky remembering old griefs. And as the last of the light wavered, Clara felt it deep in her bones. James Callahan's secrets weren't buried in the dust. They were alive in it, waiting for the wind to stir them up once more. What happens when two wounded hearts finally find each other in the dark? The storm that rolled across the Texas plains that night didn't announce itself gently. It came roaring from the west, lightning cutting jagged scars through the clouds, thunder shaking the ground beneath Hale Ranch. The rain battered the roof so fiercely that even the horses in the stable grew restless. Inside the ranch house, the fire crackled low, and every flicker of lightning illuminated the corners of the parlor like ghostly memories come to life. Clara Whitmore sat at the table near the window, candlelight dancing across her face as she graded slates from the day's lessons. The air was thick and electric, humming with a kind of tension that made the walls seem to breathe. She dipped her quill, forcing herself to focus, but her thoughts drifted. To James Callahan, to the look in his eyes the night he'd appeared in her schoolhouse doorway. There had been something there, pain, recognition, and a heaviness that didn't belong to the moment. The thunder rolled again, closer this time, and Clara flinched. She'd lived through worse storms, both in weather and in life, yet something about this one felt personal, as if the sky itself had chosen to rage for her. She was about to rise and check the shutters when the door creaked open behind her. James stood there, soaked to the bone, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked softly, setting down her pen. "Never could when it storms," he replied, removing his hat and hanging it near the door. His voice was quiet but strained. each word carrying the weight of years unsaid. "Mind if I sit?" She gestured to the chair across from her. "Please." He settled into the seat, the firelight catching on the water still clinging to his coat. For a moment neither spoke. The silence between them was charged, filled with the echo of all they'd avoided saying. Finally, Clara broke it. "When I first came here," she said, "I thought silence meant judgment, that every quiet look was pity, but now—" She hesitated, her eyes meeting his. "Now I think silence might be your way of surviving." James's gaze softened, a faint, sad smile tugging at his mouth. "You learn to keep quiet when words don't fix what's broken." Clara studied him, her heart aching at the tired honesty in his tone. "Then what does fix it?" He looked into the fire, its glow reflecting in his gray eyes. "Nothing," he said finally. "You just learn to live alongside the ache. Pretend it doesn't hurt as much as it does." Lightning flashed, followed by a crack that made the window pane rattle. Clara's pulse quickened, not from fear of the storm, but from the rawness of his confession. "What did you lose, James?" she asked quietly. For a long time he didn't answer. The storm filled the space between them, the wind howling, the rain hammering against the roof. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and distant, like someone recalling a ghost. "A woman," he said. "Years ago, before I came here. She wasn't mine to lose, not really, but I should have done something. She was caught up with a man who meant her harm. I saw the signs and did nothing. I told myself it wasn't my place. By the time I stepped in, it was too late." The candle flickered as a gust of wind slipped through a crack in the doorframe. Clara leaned forward, her breath caught in her throat. "So when you saw me—" He nodded once, his jaw tightening. It felt like the same road, different name. "I wasn't about to make the same mistake twice." The simplicity of the words broke something in her. All this time she'd believed his actions came from pity or guilt. But now she saw the truth. He'd saved her because he couldn't bear to watch another soul fall where he'd once stood still. The thunder rumbled again and the candle sputtered. The faint scent of wax filled the room. Clara reached out without thinking, her fingers brushing his hand across the table. His skin was rough, scarred, warm. "You did save me, James," she said softly. "But not because of what you did that day. You saved me by letting me find myself again." He looked at her then, really looked, and in that single glance something unspoken passed between them, fragile and vast as the storm outside. Margaret Hale's footsteps sounded briefly in the hallway, pausing near the parlor door. She peeked in, eyes narrowing at the sight of them sitting close by the candlelight. Her lips curved in a quiet, knowing smile before she retreated, leaving them alone with the sound of rain and the hum of unspoken feelings. Clara drew her hand back slowly, her cheeks warming. "Margaret will have her suspicions," she murmured. "She already knows," James said, the faintest trace of humor in his voice. It was the first time she'd heard anything close to a laugh from him. She smiled, but her eyes lingered on his face. The shadows beneath his eyes, the way his mouth seemed permanently shaped by restraint. She wondered how long it had been since he'd let anyone close enough to see the man beneath the armor. Another flash of lightning lit the room, followed by the slow growl of thunder. The sound seemed to press on the walls, intimate and enclosing. James stood, walked to the hearth, and stirred the fire. Sparks leapt upward, briefly illuminating the faint scar that ran from his temple down to his jaw. Clara rose and approached him, her curiosity soft but insistent. "How did that happen?" He hesitated, then said, "A fight. Years ago. My temper used to run faster than my reason." "Does it still?" He glanced at her over his shoulder. "Not since Dust Creek." The way he said it, quietly, reverently, made her chest tighten. She realized then that he didn't see her as a burden or a reminder of guilt. He saw her as proof that change was possible, that a man could still do something good in a world that had taken so much from him. The wind howled, rattling the shutters. Clara moved to help secure them, but James reached out, stopping her hand. His touch was light but steady. You don't have to face everything alone anymore, he said. Her breath caught. I'm not sure I remember how to let someone help. Then I'll remind you, he said, his voice low, his eyes fixed on hers. For a moment, time seemed to still. The storm outside raged, but inside the small room, the air was thick with something quieter, deeper. Clara could hear the rhythm of his breath, the steady beat of rain against the roof, and somewhere between the two, the pulse of her own heart answering his. Neither of them moved closer, yet the space between them felt alive, an invisible thread pulling tight. Then James turned slightly, his expression unreadable, but his voice trembling with truth. Your pain, he whispered, feels like mine all over again. The words cut through the sound of the storm, sharp as a confession, soft as a prayer. Clara stood frozen, the firelight painting gold across her face as the meaning of his words sank in. Outside, lightning split the sky once more, but it wasn't the thunder that made her heart tremble. It was the knowledge that for the first time since Dust Creek, neither of them was truly alone anymore. Under moonlight and wildflowers, love finally finds its voice. The night James Callahan led Clara Whitmore out from Hale Ranch, the world was washed in silver. The storm had passed 2 days prior, leaving the land scrubbed clean, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. The moon hung full and bright above the hills, spreading light across the endless stretch of Texas plains. James didn't tell her where they were going, only that he had something to show her. His voice had carried that steady calm she was beginning to trust, though she sensed a tremor beneath it, like wind before a storm. They rode in near silence, hooves muffled by soft soil. Clara's skirts brushed the wild grass that had somehow found the courage to grow again after months of drought. She watched James ride ahead, his figure cut sharp against the horizon, his shoulders broad beneath his worn shirt. It struck her how strange this moment was, how safe she felt beside the man who had once been a stranger, the man who had bought her freedom with nothing but decency and quiet conviction. After nearly half an hour, James slowed his horse and turned toward a narrow trail that wound between two low ridges. Clara followed, curiosity blooming alongside the faint flutter in her chest. The path opened into a small valley that looked as though it had been forgotten by the rest of the world. And there, in the heart of it, under the wide canopy of stars, stood a single cottonwood tree, its branches stretched wide like an old guardian's arms. Beneath it, the ground shimmered faintly where moonlight caught the surface of an underground spring. Clara gasped softly. The valley was alive. Wildflowers grew in clusters of blue and red, their colors muted by the night but unmistakable against the pale grass. She dismounted, her boots sinking into the soft earth. "How is this possible?" she whispered. "Everything for miles is dry and cracked, yet here—" "An underground spring," James said, tying his horse to a low branch, "feeds this patch and nowhere else. I found it a few years ago. Haven't told anyone, not even the Hales. I come here when the world feels too heavy." She turned to him, her eyes wide. "And you brought me?" He nodded, his voice quiet. "Seemed right. You deserve to see something that still grows." For a moment she couldn't speak. The air hummed with life, with the steady trickle of the spring and the whisper of the breeze through the cottonwood leaves. She knelt and touched the ground, cool and damp beneath her fingertips. Hope, she thought, had a texture after all. When she rose, she found James spreading a blanket near the base of the tree. Beside it sat a basket, its contents covered with a checkered cloth. "Margaret's doing," he admitted when she raised an eyebrow. "Told her I needed supplies for an evening ride. She didn't ask questions, but I think she guessed." Clara smiled, her heart catching on the tenderness of it all. "You've planned something." He hesitated, his hands stilling as he straightened the blanket. "I suppose I have." He gestured for her to sit, and when she did, he knelt beside her, the tension in his posture unmistakable. The moonlight carved the planes of his face in silver and shadow, his eyes unreadable. "I've been trying to find the right words for weeks," he began slowly. "But words never come easy for me. He looked out toward the spring, the reflection of the moon dancing across its surface. When I first saw you in Dust Creek, I thought I was looking at someone the world had already decided to break, and I hated myself for recognizing that look because I'd seen it before, in her, the woman I told you about, the one I failed. Clara's breath caught. James, you don't have to. Yes, I do. His voice was rough now, thick with something raw. I failed her by standing still, by thinking doing nothing was the same as keeping the peace. But when I saw you up there, bound and terrified, I knew that if I didn't move, I'd carry that same regret for the rest of my life. So I bid. And I thought maybe, just maybe, I could save one life, even if it didn't fix what came before. The wind sighed through the branches, scattering moonlight over his face. Clara's throat tightened, her chest aching with emotion. You didn't just save me, James, she said softly. You gave me a chance to remember who I am, to build something again. He turned toward her then, eyes glimmering. You did that yourself, Clara. You found your own way out of the dark. For a moment, silence wrapped around them, tender and full. The scent of wildflowers mingled with the damp air. Then James reached into his coat and pulled out a small box, its wood worn smooth by nervous hands. Maybe it's too soon, he said quietly. But life's too fragile to keep waiting for perfect moments. He opened the box. Inside, a simple gold band caught the light, its small diamond winking like starlight. Clara's breath shuddered out of her. James. He held her gaze, his voice steady but trembling at the edges. Clara Whitmore. I've spent my life running from ghosts, mistakes, guilt, things I can't undo, but you make me want to stay still for once. You make me believe in tomorrow. Marry me. Let me build something real with you. Let me wake up every morning knowing I earned the right to stand beside you. Tears blurred Clara's vision, the weight of the moment pressing against her ribs. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. The rustle of leaves, the hum of insects, even the air itself holding its breath. Then she nodded, the word breaking free like a prayer. Yes. James let out a shaky laugh of disbelief, his eyes bright. He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled. It fits, he murmured, smiling faintly. Of course it does, she said, her voice trembling. It was meant to. Then his lips found hers, hesitant at first, then certain, like rain meeting dry earth. The kiss was nothing like she'd ever known. It wasn't desperate or fleeting, but full, honest, a promise carved in breath and heartbeat. When they finally parted, both were shaking, both smiling through tears. They sat beneath the cottonwood tree, hand in hand, while the world around them seemed to exhale. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to imagine a life not defined by survival, but by love. A home, laughter, a garden growing wild with color. Beside her, James was quiet, his thumb tracing gentle circles against her palm as if grounding himself in the reality of her presence. The moon climbed higher, painting their joined hands in light. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. I never thought I'd belong anywhere again, she whispered. You belong here, James said softly. With me. Always. They stayed that way until the first chill crept into the air, the valley wrapped in silver and shadow. But even as the wind shifted and the cottonwood leaves rustled like soft applause, Clara knew that love like this, born from ruin, tempered by pain, was fragile, because the world they lived in wasn't kind to miracles. It had tried to crush her once. It could try again. As James packed the blanket and reached for her hand, Clara's gaze lingered on the ring gleaming faintly in the moonlight. It felt like both a promise and a dare. The question lingered unspoken but heavy between them as they rode back toward the ranch. How would their love survive in a world that once sold her freedom? When the heavens open after a long drought, what else might be reborn? The evening of the celebration at Hale Ranch shimmered with warmth and the hum of a community slowly rediscovering hope. Lanterns swung gently from the porch beams, casting halos of amber light across the yard. Laughter mingled with the sounds of clinking cutlery and the low murmur of fiddles from the bunkhouse. The drought had nearly broken them all, but tonight, for the first time in months, Dust Creek didn't feel like a place dying of thirst. It felt alive. Clara Whitmore sat at the long dining table beside James Callahan, her hands folded tightly in her lap as Margaret Hale brought out one dish after another. Roasted chicken, fresh bread, peaches preserved from last summer's meager harvest. The table was lined with ranch hands, neighbors, and children who had spent the past months learning to write their names beneath her careful guidance. Their laughter filled the room like music. When Thomas Hale raised his glass, the chatter fell to a hush. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice deep and steady. "And to the courage it takes to make something out of nothing. Dust Creek's still standing because folks like you," he nodded toward Clara, "remembered what community means." A soft flush rose to her cheeks. She hadn't realized how much she'd given to this place until she saw it reflected in their faces. The gratitude, the respect, the belief that she had somehow brought light where there'd once been only dust. Margaret's eyes glistened as she added, "And to Clara Whitmore, who taught us that strength isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up and building something beautiful from the broken pieces." Applause filled the room. Clara tried to speak but found her voice too thick with emotion. Then beneath the table she felt James's hand find hers, steady and grounding. When she turned to him, his expression was soft, full of pride and something deeper, something that made her heart flutter in a way she was still getting used to. Later, when the dishes were cleared and the laughter began to fade into the night, James leaned close. "Come with me," he said quietly. "There's something I want to show you." The stars had begun to emerge by the time they saddled their horses. The air was thick with the scent of approaching rain, that strange sweetness that teased the ground before the first drop ever fell. Clara followed him north, the trail unfamiliar, the night wind tugging at her hair. After 15 minutes, James slowed his horse and nodded toward a shallow valley ahead. "There," he said softly. At first, she saw only the outline of a structure against the horizon, dark timbers rising from the earth like ribs. But as they rode closer, the shape took form. Walls, a roof half-built, windows framed but not yet fitted with glass. The smell of fresh-cut wood lingered in the air. Clara dismounted, her boots crunching over dry soil as she stepped toward it. "What is this?" she whispered. James followed her gaze, his face unreadable in the starlight. "Ours," he said simply. "Or it will be when it's done." The words hit her like a heartbeat. "You've been building this?" "Every spare hour I could steal," he said. "Thomas sold me this parcel, called it a wedding gift, though I'm still paying him back. Some of the men helped when they could. I wanted to give you something solid, a place that's ours." Clara's throat tightened as she stepped inside the half-finished house. The moonlight spilled across the wooden floorboards, soft and silvery. She could already imagine it, the fireplace glowing, books stacked along the walls, laughter echoing where there was now only silence. "How many rooms?" she asked, her voice trembling with awe. "4," he said. "2 bedrooms for now. Kitchen here." He gestured toward the east wall. "I'll build a porch out front so you can watch the sunrise. Maybe a garden once the rain comes back." Her fingers brushed along the smooth wood of the doorway. "It's perfect." He smiled faintly. "It's not done." "It doesn't have to be," she said, turning toward him. "It's already home." They stood facing each other, the still night pressing in around them. Somewhere far off, thunder rumbled. Clara looked up just as a streak of lightning tore across the horizon, lighting James's face in a flash of white. He was watching her, not as a man uncertain of his place, but as one who had finally found it. A drop of rain fell against her cheek, then another, and another. Within moments, the sky broke open. The first true rain in nearly a year came pouring down in thick, heavy sheets, splattering against the roof beams and turning the ground to mud. Clara laughed, a bright, startled sound as the water soaked through her dress. She held out her hands, feeling the cool weight of it, the miracle of it. "It's raining," she shouted over the downpour. James stepped closer, rain running down his face, soaking his shirt until it clung to him. "Looks like the drought's finally giving up." She looked around at the valley, at the half-built home standing solid against the storm. The earth drank deeply, greedily, as if desperate to remember what life felt like. "It's more than that," she whispered. "It's the world starting over." James's hand found hers, fingers intertwining, rainwater slipping between them. He smiled, the kind of smile that came from deep inside. "Then maybe it's our turn to start over too." The rain grew harder, pounding against the roof, drumming like a heartbeat. Clara tilted her face upward, eyes closed, letting it wash over her. She thought of the woman she'd been the day she'd stood on the auction block, bound, terrified, stripped of everything. And then she thought of the woman standing here now, drenched in freedom and love, her heart beating in rhythm with the rain. When she opened her eyes, James was watching her. The look in his eyes made her breath hitch, a mix of wonder and devotion, as though he couldn't quite believe she was real. Without thinking, Clara reached up, brushing the wet hair from his forehead. "You built this," she murmured. "You built us." He shook his head, water flying from his hair. "No, Clara, we did." They kissed then, not with urgency but with gratitude, a slow, steady joining of everything they had endured. The rain poured harder, but neither cared. Around them, the world seemed to hum with renewal. When they finally pulled apart, Clara laughed through tears she didn't bother to hide. "Do you realize what this means? That I'll have to rebuild half this roof by morning?" he teased. She swatted his shoulder, still smiling. "It means the drought's over, for the land, for us, for everything." They stood there until the thunder softened into a distant murmur, and the rain turned to a gentle patter. The earth beneath their boots had transformed, muddy, alive, forgiving. Clara took one last look at the unfinished house, its walls glistening under the stormlight. She realized then that what they were building wasn't just a home. It was proof that something beautiful could rise from ruin. As James gathered the horses and she lingered by the doorway, her hand resting on the smooth wood, she felt a calm she hadn't known in years. The rain had done more than soak the ground. It had seeped into the cracks of her soul, softening the hardened places, washing away the last remnants of fear. And as they rode back through the rain toward the flickering lights of Hale Ranch, Clara looked over her shoulder at the shadow of their future taking shape behind them. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. But even in that moment of joy, she couldn't help but feel a shiver of awe, and something deeper. Because as the heavens opened and poured mercy on Dust Creek, she realized she wasn't just building a house or a life. She was building a future she had once believed she would never deserve. From bound wrists to a ring of gold. Can love truly rewrite the past? The morning of Christmas dawned clear and cold, the kind of Texas winter day that carried a stillness almost sacred. Frost shimmered across the fields like lace, and the sun spilled soft light over Hale Ranch, turning every roof and fence post to silver. Inside the house, however, quiet reverence had been replaced by a flurry of activity. Voices calling from room to room, laughter mixing with the scent of coffee, cinnamon, and evergreen. For Clara Whitmore, it was a day that once felt impossible. A year ago, she had stood in a dusty town square, her wrists bound by rough rope. Today, those same hands trembled not from fear, but from joy as Margaret Hale and Evelyn Callahan fussed over her final preparations. Margaret's capable hands worked deftly, smoothing the folds of Clara's white cotton gown. "Hold still now, dear," she said, her tone brisk but tender. "Evelyn, pass me that pin." Evelyn, elegant even in her practicality, smiled as she handed it over. "I swear, Margaret, this dress will outshine the sunrise." The gown had been a labor of love, a simple creation made beautiful by its details. The seamstress from the nearby town of Margaret had embroidered a ring of Texas bluebonnets along the hem, their delicate blue threads catching the light. Each stitch, Margaret had said, represented something new: hope, growth, forgiveness. When Clara finally looked at her reflection, she hardly recognized the woman staring back. The copper in her hair glowed beneath the morning light. Her cheeks were flushed with life, and her eyes, clear, steady, and unafraid, told the story of a soul reborn. Evelyn stepped closer, studying her face as though memorizing it. "You have strength in your eyes," she said softly. "That's what drew my son to you. He saw it long before the rest of us could." Clara's throat tightened. "He gave me the courage to see it myself." Margaret's eyes misted. "And now you're marrying him. The Lord surely loves a story with a good ending." Outside, the ranch buzzed with anticipation. Friends, ranch hands, neighbors, and former students of Clara's gathered in the main room and along the porch, their Sunday best pressed in their hearts' light. The Hales had cleared out the big parlor, setting up chairs borrowed from half the county. A garland of evergreen and pine cones hung across the mantel, and candles flickered on every flat surface. When Clara finally stepped into the doorway, the murmur of conversation hushed. For a breathless moment, all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. Then she saw him, James Callahan, waiting by the hearth where the minister stood. He wore a black suit that fit him awkwardly, as if the clothes couldn't quite contain the man he'd become. His usually unruly hair had been tamed, though a single lock refused to behave, curling across his forehead. But it was his expression that undid her, the look of quiet awe, of reverence, as though he still couldn't believe she was real. Thomas Hale stepped forward, his arm extended. "Ready, daughter?" he asked, pride softening his weathered face. Clara nodded, barely trusting her voice. "More than I ever thought I'd be." The walk down the aisle seemed both endless and far too short. Every face she passed carried a memory. People who had pitied her once, now smiling with genuine affection. Some wiped away tears, others clasped their hands together as if witnessing something holy. When she reached the front, Thomas placed her hand in James's. His rough palm met hers, warm and steady, grounding her in the moment. The minister's voice rose above the quiet rustle of the crowd. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here on this blessed day to join together James Callahan and Clara Whitmore in holy matrimony." Clara barely heard the words. Her world had narrowed to the man standing before her, to the tremor in his thumb as he rubbed gentle circles against her hand, to the look in his eyes that said, "We made it." When it came time to speak their vows, James's voice was low but sure. "Clara," he began, "you've seen the worst of this world and still found beauty in it. You've seen me at my lowest and believed I could be more. I spent years trying to make peace with what I'd done, but the day I met you, I realized peace isn't something a man earns. It's something he builds, one choice at a time. I promise to spend my life making choices that honor you." Her breath shuddered. When it was her turn, Clara met his gaze without wavering. "James, you gave me freedom when you had no reason to. You saw worth in me when I couldn't. You taught me that love isn't about erasing the past, it's about transforming it. So I promise to walk beside you not as someone you saved, but as your equal, your partner, your home." The minister's voice softened. "With these vows spoken and these hearts bound, I now pronounce you husband and wife." James reached for her, his touch reverent. Their first kiss as husband and wife wasn't the desperate rush of lovers, but the quiet sealing of a promise. The room erupted in applause, cheers echoing off the timbered ceiling. "Mrs. Callahan," he whispered against her lips, tasting the words like something sacred. Clara laughed, her eyes bright with tears. "That's going to take some getting used to." The celebration that followed spilled from the house into the yard. The fiddle struck up a lively tune, and soon even the shyest guests were dancing. The smell of roasted ham and cinnamon pies filled the air, and children darted between adults, their laughter mingling with music. When James led her to the open floor, the crowd parted. His hand rested gently on her waist, his other holding hers. They began to sway, slow at first, then turning with the rhythm of the music. You remember the day I first saw you? He asked softly. I remember thinking I'd never forgive you, she said with a teasing smile. And now I thank God every day that you didn't walk away. They moved together as if they'd been doing it their whole lives, the world shrinking until it was only the two of them, spinning beneath the soft glow of lantern light. Margaret dabbed her eyes with her apron, whispering something to Evelyn, who simply smiled and nodded. Around them, the community that had once pitied Clara now celebrated her as one of their own. By the time the last song played, the fire had burned low and the stars glittered like frost overhead. James's arms stayed around her as the final notes faded, his breath warm against her ear. So, he murmured, how does it feel to be a Callahan? Clara leaned back just enough to meet his gaze, her smile trembling with emotion. It feels like forgiveness, she whispered, like coming home. The guests began to drift away, their laughter echoing into the night. The last embers of the fire glowed low, and for a moment the ranch was wrapped in peace. But as James and Clara stood beneath the cold Texas sky, holding hands and dreaming of what came next, a quiet thought stirred in the back of her mind. Love had saved her, yes, but life still had its trials waiting beyond the warmth of this night. As the final candle flickered and went out, Clara felt it deep in her heart. The hardest part of any story wasn't the beginning or even the end. It was what came after the vows. When love was tested not by words but by the weight of the world itself. Love is easy to promise but hard to build, especially under a Texas sky. The weeks that followed their Christmas wedding settled like dust after a long ride, soft, inevitable, and full of quiet beginnings. The newly built Callahan homestead stood sturdy against the rolling plains, its rough-hewn boards glowing honey gold in the winter light. Though modest, it was theirs. Every nail, every beam, every pane of glass held the mark of their shared labor. For Clara Whitmore, no, Clara Callahan now, the house wasn't just shelter. It was proof that she'd survived, rebuilt, and finally belonged. Each morning began before sunrise. The smell of coffee filled the small kitchen as Clara stirred the fire to life while James pulled on his boots, readying the horses. The wind outside carried the faint cry of coyotes across the distant ridges, but within the walls of their home, the world was still. They often worked in companionable silence. Two souls shaped by struggle, now moving through a peace they'd both earned the hard way. By early spring, the schoolhouse was thriving. The children who had once struggled to hold a pencil now raced to recite their lessons, their laughter spilling out the open door like sunlight. Clara expanded her work beyond daylight hours, starting evening classes for the ranch hands and nearby farmers, men and women who had never learned to read or write. Word spread quickly, and soon the schoolhouse lamps glowed late into the night, beacons of quiet determination in the dusty dark. James would wait outside on those evenings, sometimes leaning against the fence rail, sometimes tending a small fire until she was ready to head home. Watching her walk toward him through the twilight, the lantern swinging in her hand, her face aglow with purpose, became the highlight of his days. He never said it outright, but Clara knew. His pride in her ran deep as bedrock. Meanwhile, life on the ranch took on its own rhythm. James had begun expanding his small herd with Thomas Hale's guidance. The land, revived by the rain that had broken the drought, was yielding again. Together, he and Thomas repaired old corrals, dug a new well, and marked out the fencing for a future barn. It was hard work, the kind that left him bone-tired and sore. But there was satisfaction in it. He'd once lived by drifting, never staying long enough to build anything lasting. Now each day at the Callahan ranch was another brick in a life he was finally proud of. Yet even the strongest love had its friction. The first disagreement came over something small. Clara had stayed too late at the schoolhouse again, and James, worried, had ridden out in the dark to find her. She'd bristled at his concern, mistaking it for mistrust. He'd tried to explain that he wasn't angry, only afraid of losing what he'd just found. The argument ended not in anger, but in quiet understanding. A long, wordless embrace that reminded them both how easily fear could disguise itself as care. Later, there were other moments. James pushing himself too hard in the fields, Clara insisting he rest, Clara taking on too many students, James teasing that she'd try to educate all of Texas if given the chance. Their tempers occasionally flared, but it always burned out quickly, replaced by laughter or silence softened by love. They were learning the rhythm of each other, like two notes finding harmony after a lifetime of dissonance. By midsummer, the ranch had transformed. The garden flourished behind their house, heavy with corn and beans. The sound of the creek nearby filled the evenings, mingling with the low hum of cicadas. The community often gathered for Sunday suppers, bringing food and stories, children running wild under the open sky. The Callahan's home had become a kind of heart for the valley, a place where people felt welcome, where hardship met hospitality. But amid all the bustle, Clara sometimes found herself pausing at the window after dusk, looking out across the land. The setting sun turned the fields amber, and she would watch James working in the distance, his silhouette steady against the horizon. She'd never imagined this kind of life, one built not on survival but on trust. The ache of her past hadn't disappeared, it had simply softened into something bearable, a shadow that reminded her how far she'd come. One evening, as the summer heat gave way to a cooler breeze, James came in from the fields with dust on his boots and sweat streaking his neck. Clara was sitting by the fire, a book open on her lap, her hair loose from its pins. He paused in the doorway, watching her with the same quiet reverence he'd felt since the day he first saw her standing on the auction block. "Long day?" she asked, smiling up at him. "Good kind of long," he replied, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "Everything's holding steady. Hale says the cattle will be ready to move come fall." She closed her book and set it aside. "You've built something incredible, James. All this," she gestured around them, you made it real." He chuckled softly. "We made it real." They ate supper by lamplight, the simple comfort of shared quiet filling the room. Later, as the fire dwindled to glowing embers, Clara settled beside him on the small settee, her head resting against his shoulder. Outside, crickets sang beneath the stars. Inside, the crackle of the hearth and the rhythm of their breathing wove together into a peace neither had known before. "This feels like home," Clara murmured, her eyes half closed. James looked down at her, his expression tender. "It is home," he said, "because you're in it." They sat like that for a long time, wrapped in warmth and contentment. The flames flickered lower, shadows swaying across the walls. James reached for her hand, tracing idle circles along her palm, a habit he'd picked up whenever words felt too small. Then something shifted. Clara stirred slightly, pressing a hand to her stomach. She frowned, just a flicker of curiosity, not pain. James noticed. "You all right?" "I think so," she said softly. "Just felt something strange." He rested his calloused hand over hers, palm against the gentle curve of her belly. For a moment there was only silence. The fire's glow reflected in their eyes, the faint tick of the clock in the corner. Then he felt it, a flutter so faint it might have been imagined, but it was real, a spark of movement, small as breath, deep as eternity. Clara gasped, her hand gripping his. "James!" He stared at her, the realization dawning slowly, reverently. "Are you—" Her eyes filled with tears, her smile trembling. "I think so." For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Then James let out a sound, half laugh, half prayer, and pulled her close, his hand still pressed against the miracle that had just revealed itself. Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of earth and rain. Inside, two souls who had once been broken sat by their fire, holding the fragile beginning of the next chapter in their story. They had built a life from dust, and now life itself was growing within it. Some miracles don't arrive with thunder, they whisper from within. Spring swept across Dust Creek like a long-forgotten hymn, soft and hesitant at first, then full and alive. The land that had once cracked beneath the sun now shimmered with new grass, and the air carried the scent of wildflowers reborn from the soil's forgiveness. For Clara Callahan, every morning felt touched by grace, Yet the greatest change of all was not in the land around her, but in the quiet secret that had taken root inside her. It had been weeks since that first flutter beneath her ribs. At first, she hadn't trusted it, afraid to believe something so miraculous could truly belong to her. But as the days passed and the feeling grew stronger, more certain, she began to realize that life, fragile, new, and full of promise, was growing inside her. One evening, she stood by the open window, the warm wind tugging gently at her hair. The smell of honeysuckle drifted in from the garden, mingling with the earthy scent of the freshly tilled fields. Behind her, James was finishing his chores, his voice humming low as he put away tools. Clara turned to him, her hands folded over her stomach. "James," she said softly, "I need to tell you something." He looked up immediately, the teasing light in his eyes dimming into concern. "You all right?" She smiled, tears threatening before she could even speak. "More than all right." He frowned, uncertain, until the truth dawned. His gaze fell to her hands, then back to her face. "Clara," he whispered as though afraid to break the moment. "You mean—" She nodded, unable to speak through the lump in her throat. "We're going to have a child." For a long heartbeat, James stood frozen. Then the tension in his body shattered. A laugh, pure, unrestrained, full of disbelief and wonder, escaped him. He crossed the room in 2 strides, lifting her into his arms and spinning her until both were laughing and crying at once. When he finally set her down, his hands lingered on her cheeks, his forehead resting against hers. "I don't deserve this," he murmured, "but I swear to you I'll spend every day trying to." Clara smiled through her tears. "This isn't about what we deserve. It's about grace." That night, unable to sleep, James led her outside to the place that had come to define every turning point in their lives, the hidden valley beneath the cottonwood tree. The air was warm, thick with the perfume of blooming sage. The moon hung low, its silver light draping over the land like a blessing. They spread a blanket beneath the cottonwood's familiar branches. Clara leaned into him, her hand resting on the gentle swell that marked the beginning of their future. "When I stood here before," she whispered, "I thought the world had finally forgiven me. But now—" She paused, her voice trembling. "Now I realize it wasn't forgiveness I needed, it was faith. Faith that I could still create something good." James's arm tightened around her. "You already have." They sat in silence, listening to the soft murmur of the spring nearby. Crickets sang their steady song, and somewhere in the distance an owl called to the night. Clara tilted her head back, staring at the stars scattered across the black sky. Each one seemed to shimmer a little brighter, as if celebrating with them. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small carving. A wooden rose, its petals delicate and smooth. "Started whittling this before I even knew," he said shyly. "Guess I hoped somehow." Clara turned it over in her hand, smiling. "Then maybe you already knew before I did." Over the next months, the news spread quietly through Dust Creek, and the small community rallied in a way only frontier towns could. Margaret Hale arrived the next morning with bolts of muslin and determination. "You'll need baby clothes," she declared, rolling up her sleeves. "And I don't want to hear a word about rest until we've got enough blankets to keep this little one warmer than a Texas July." Evelyn Callahan came 2 days later, a wagon full of herbs, teas, and stories from her own motherhood tucked under her arm. She took Clara's hand in hers, her eyes soft with understanding. "Every birth changes a woman," she said. "Not just in body, but in spirit. You'll see the world different after this, softer and sharper all at once." Evening after evening, the women gathered at the Callahan home, stitching, cooking, talking. The house filled with laughter and the sound of gentle advice offered over cups of tea. For Clara, who had once known only silence and suspicion, the noise was a kind of music, a reminder that she had found family not through blood but through the bond of survival and grace. As her belly grew, so did the school. Her students brought flowers and trinkets, gifts from their small hands and big hearts. The children's parents began showing up on Sundays with baskets of food or wood for the fire, small gestures that meant more than words ever could. Even the men at the ranch built a cradle, hand-carved with vines and blossoms. One afternoon, as Clara stood watching the children play outside the schoolhouse, she caught her reflection in the window pane. The woman staring back looked content, certain, and unrecognizably strong. The lines of fear had softened into something luminous. It struck her then how far she had come, from the woman sold for a sack of grain to the teacher, wife, and soon-to-be mother who now shaped lives instead of being shaped by cruelty. That evening she sat by the fire with James, his hand resting over hers on her rounded stomach. The firelight flickered against his face, warm and gold. "Have you thought about names?" he asked. She smiled. "A few. But there's one that feels right." He waited, his eyes curious. "Lydia," she said softly. "Lydia Rose." "Lydia Rose," he repeated, testing the sound of it, his expression softening. "That's beautiful. It's my mother's middle name," Clara explained, her voice hushed. "And Rose, because it was the first thing that ever grew back in Dust Creek after the rain." James brushed his thumb along her knuckles. "Then it's settled. Lydia Rose Callahan. Strong name for a strong girl." Clara leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "She'll have your kindness," she murmured, "and your patience." He chuckled quietly. "Patience isn't exactly what I'm known for." "You've learned it," she said, "and you taught it to me." The fire popped softly. Outside, a light wind swept across the land, carrying the faint scent of the coming summer. Clara closed her eyes, feeling the steady rhythm of life within her. It was a quiet miracle, one that didn't come with thunder or grandeur, but with warmth and purpose. The same way love had found her, gently, insistently, like light filtering through clouds. But as the weeks turned into months and the heat of summer deepened, a heaviness began to settle in her body. The days grew long and the nights restless. James noticed the fatigue she tried to hide, the way she sometimes winced when she thought he wasn't looking. He told himself not to worry, that women grew weary near the end, that all would be well. Still, when autumn's chill returned to the air and the leaves began to fall, a shadow of unease settled over them both. Because even miracles, Clara knew, came with their trials. And as the wind howled through the cottonwoods on the night her labor began, it carried a message she could feel deep in her bones. This birth would not be the gentle story they had dreamed of. Before dawn breaks, a cry will change everything forever. The wind began to howl across the plains long before the pain came. It was the kind of October night that carried a warning in its chill. Cold enough to make the windows rattle. Restless enough to set the horses pacing in their stalls. Inside the Callahan house, firelight flickered weakly against the walls, throwing nervous shadows across the room where Clara gripped the edge of the bed, her face pale and damp with sweat. The first contraction had struck late in the afternoon, sudden and sharp, stealing her breath mid-sentence while she was folding the last of the baby clothes. She had laughed it off at first, insisting it was too soon, but as twilight bled into night, the pains deepened, spreading through her like the slow roll of thunder before a storm. By the time James came in from the fields, she could barely stand. He caught her as she doubled over, his face draining of color. "Clara, it's time," she managed between gasps, her hands clutching his sleeves. James froze for half a second, long enough for panic to flash in his eyes before instinct took over. "I'll get Margaret," he said, already reaching for his coat. Within the hour, Margaret Hale was at their door, her calm presence cutting through the chaos like steady light through fog. She brought with her a satchel of herbs, clean linens, and the quiet authority of a woman who'd seen both birth and death and knew how fine the line between them could be. "Boil some water, James," she ordered briskly, "and keep that fire steady. It's going to be a long night." James did as he was told, moving as if in a dream. The house that had always felt warm now seemed foreign, the familiar walls closing in around him. Every sound, Clara's sharp breaths, the creak of the floorboards, the hiss of the fire seemed magnified, echoing the rhythm of her labor. Clara's world narrowed to waves of pain, each one stronger than the last. Time lost all meaning. Sometimes she heard Margaret's voice, firm and reassuring. "Breathe, child, that's it, you're doing fine." Sometimes she felt James's hand, rough and trembling, holding hers with desperate tenderness. Between contractions, she caught glimpses of his face, pale, drawn, eyes shining with fear and love all tangled together. At one point, a particularly harsh spasm tore through her, and she cried out, her voice breaking. James leaned close, his forehead pressed to hers. "I'd take it from you if I could," he whispered, voice raw. "Every bit of it." "I know," she gasped, gripping his hand hard enough to leave marks. "But you can't. So stay with me." "I'm not going anywhere," he promised. And he didn't. Hours passed in a blur of sweat, pain, and whispered prayers. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, the night dragging on endlessly. Inside, Margaret moved with the unhurried precision of someone who'd weathered many storms before. She wiped Clara's brow, timed her breathing, whispered encouragement when the younger woman's strength faltered. When Clara grew too weak to speak, Margaret's steady voice became the only thing anchoring her to the world. "That's it, darling. One breath, one push. She's almost here. I can feel it." James stood helpless beside them, his hands shaking despite his efforts to be strong. He had faced drought, death, and desolation, but nothing had ever terrified him like this. The sight of the woman he loved caught between agony and creation, her body fighting to bring forth life. Sometime in the darkest hours before dawn, the rhythm changed. The air in the room thickened with tension and anticipation. Clara's breathing grew ragged, but her eyes, glazed with exhaustion, held a fierce determination. She had faced worse storms and survived. She would survive this one too. Margaret leaned close, her voice low but urgent. "All right now, Clara. One more, that's it. One last push." Clara gathered what little strength she had left and bore down, her cry filling the room, a sound of pain, defiance, and sheer will. Then suddenly silence. A heartbeat later, the silence broke, split open by a sharp, unmistakable wail. The sound was small, fragile, and yet it filled every corner of the room. It was the sound of victory, of life snatched from the hands of suffering. It was the first cry of Lydia Rose Callahan. James let out a broken laugh that turned into a sob, his knees nearly giving out beneath him. Margaret's smile, weary but radiant, glowed in the firelight as she lifted the tiny bundle and laid her gently in Clara's trembling arms. "She's perfect," Margaret whispered. Clara stared down at the tiny face, her breath catching. Lydia's skin was flushed and soft, her small hands curling and uncurling with instinctive life. Her cries faded to soft whimpers as Clara whispered her name for the first time. "Lydia Rose," she breathed. "You made it, little one." James knelt beside the bed, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch his daughter's cheek. The warmth of her skin stunned him, so delicate, so impossibly real. "She's..." His voice broke. "She's everything." Clara smiled faintly, exhaustion painting her voice soft. "She's ours." Outside, the first hint of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the Texas sky in streaks of pink and gold. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean. Light filtered through the frosted window panes, catching the tears on Clara's face, turning them to diamonds. James looked between his wife and daughter and felt something inside him shift. All the guilt, all the years of trying to make peace with the man he'd been. It all fell away, replaced by the simple truth that Grace had found him after all. Margaret gathered her things quietly, giving them space. "I'll make breakfast," she murmured, though she knew they wouldn't eat for hours. When she left, the small family sat together in the pale morning light. Lydia slept against Clara's chest, her tiny breath syncing with her mother's heartbeat. James brushed a lock of hair from Clara's forehead and kissed her gently. "You did it," he whispered. "We did it," she corrected softly, her voice barely above a whisper. You never left." He smiled, a mix of awe and disbelief still written across his face. "I never will." They sat in silence, watching the sunrise through the window. The light spilled across the wooden floor, catching the cradle waiting beside the bed. Outside, the world seemed to pause, Dust Creek awakening slowly, unaware that within a small house at the edge of the valley, something new had begun. For Clara, the moment felt like a circle closing. A year ago, she had been a woman without freedom, without hope. Now she was a mother holding her child beneath the first light of dawn. Every scar, every loss, every pain had led her here, to this room, this man, this fragile miracle. The fire crackled softly and the day began. But as joy settled over the Callahan house, another truth stirred quietly beneath it. The schoolhouse still waited. Her students still looked to her. And somewhere deep within her heart, Clara wondered, could she still be the woman who taught the world to rise while learning all over again how to stand herself? The first cry had changed everything. But what came next would test every ounce of strength she had left. The greatest lessons aren't written in books. They're lived. Spring came early to Dust Creek that year, and with it came laughter, the kind that floated out through open windows and over the hills like sunlight. In the Callahan house, baby Lydia's giggles had become part of the rhythm of every day, mingling with the scrape of James's boots on the porch and the familiar hum of Clara's voice as she marked papers or read aloud from one of her precious books. The world felt new again, softer somehow, as if the land itself had been waiting for their joy to take root. By February, Clara had begun preparing to reopen her school. It had been 4 months since Lydia's birth, and though her body still carried the ache of recovery, her spirit ached more for the classroom. The rows of small desks, the smell of chalk and ink, the sound of discovery. She missed the children's eager questions, their laughter, the spark in their eyes when they finally understood something that had once seemed impossible. Still, she hesitated the morning she set her books back on the shelf. She looked down at the small bundle in her arms, Lydia, bright-eyed and cooing, and wondered if she was asking too much of herself. James found her there, her brow furrowed, torn between worlds. "You'll never stop teaching," he said, his voice gentle. "It's who you are. But you don't have to do it alone this time." She smiled faintly. "You mean you're volunteering for alphabet lessons?" "I was thinking more of the heavy lifting," he said, grinning. "But I'll learn my letters if it helps." That afternoon, he hitched the wagon and helped her load her supplies. The chalkboard she refused to replace, the little desks Thomas Hale had repaired, and the box of books the community had donated. When they reached the schoolhouse, Clara stepped down. Lydia nestled in her arms and stood for a long moment staring at the building that had once saved her. The door creaked as it always had, but the room inside seemed brighter, warmer. Dust motes danced in the slant of sunlight spilling through the windows, and the air smelled faintly of pine from the new floorboards James had installed while she was recovering. She set Lydia's cradle near her desk, the baby gurgling as if approving the arrangement. When the students arrived the next morning, the schoolhouse erupted in a kind of organized chaos that made Clara's heart swell. Children crowded around the cradle, whispering and giggling. Lydia seemed delighted by the attention, flailing her tiny fists in excitement. "Settle down now," Clara said, trying to sound stern, though her smile betrayed her. "We've got lessons to learn, and Miss Lydia here will be watching closely to make sure you're all on your best behavior." The room erupted in laughter, but beneath it was something more profound. Connection, belonging, joy. The children who had once been shy or uncertain now worked harder than ever, eager to impress both their teacher and the tiny spectator who seemed to brighten every corner of the room. As the weeks went on, word spread through the valley that Miss Clara was teaching again, and soon the evening adult classes returned as well. Ranch hands, mothers, and even older ranchers began attending after supper, their faces lined with fatigue but their eyes alive with hunger for knowledge. They came not just to learn letters and numbers, but to be part of something that reminded them the world could grow again. even after drought and sorrow. James often stopped by during those evening sessions, leaning in the doorway as the flicker of lamplight danced across the room. Sometimes he'd hold Lydia in his arms while Clara taught, swaying gently to keep her calm. He never said much, but the pride in his eyes spoke volumes. This harmony of learning, laughter, and love was what they had both been fighting toward all along. One night after the last student had gone, Clara found James still standing by the door, the lamplight catching the curve of his smile. "You've built more than a school here," he said quietly. "You've built hope." Clara stepped closer, brushing her hand against his. "We built it. Together." He looked at her then, the same way he had that first night under the cottonwood tree. Like she was something precious he still couldn't quite believe was real. "Maybe," he said softly, "but you're the one who taught me how." Life settled into a rhythm that was both busy and beautiful. Mornings were for lessons, afternoons for tending the garden or helping on the ranch, and evenings for laughter around the fire. Clara learned to balance teaching with motherhood, discovering that patience was the bridge between both. Lydia grew quickly, her curiosity already evident in the way her eyes followed her mother's every movement in the classroom. Some nights, when the house had gone quiet and Lydia slept soundly in her cradle, Clara and James would sit together by the hearth, their hands intertwined, talking softly about the future. There were plans to expand the school, to buy more land, to plant fruit trees behind the house come spring. But sometimes they didn't talk at all, just sat in the glow of the fire, content in the life they had carved from dust and persistence. As the first anniversary of her arrival at Hale Ranch approached, Clara found herself reflecting more often. It felt impossible that a full year had passed since the day she'd been led into Dust Creek bound and broken. The memory still had edges that cut, but it no longer defined her. Instead, it had become a chapter in a story about endurance, about what could bloom even after fire. She marked the days quietly, not wanting to dwell too long on the pain of the past. But she noticed that James had been restless lately, slipping away after supper, claiming to have chores that couldn't wait, coming home late with a mysterious smile that only deepened her curiosity. "What are you up to?" she asked one night, narrowing her eyes playfully as she folded laundry. He shrugged innocently. "A man can't surprise his wife anymore? I've learned that when you say surprise, it usually involves sawdust or blisters," she teased. He only grinned, kissed her forehead, and disappeared again into the night. By late March, the valley was in full bloom. Wildflowers carpeted the hills, and the cottonwood tree in the hidden valley had burst into fresh green leaves. The land had healed. So had they. That week, Clara's students presented her with something that made her heart ache in the best possible way. A hand-drawn map of Dust Creek with her school marked in the center, labeled simply, "Miss Clara's Place of Hope." She wept when she saw it, holding Lydia close as the children explained every detail. The tiny desks, the bookcase, the window where the light hit just right. She realized then that her classroom wasn't just a building. It was a sanctuary, one she had built not just for others but for herself. That night, as the sun slipped behind the ridge and the first stars began to appear, James appeared at the door, his face alight with that same secretive look. "Put on your shawl," he said, his tone warm with mischief. "There's something I want to show you." Clara raised a brow but smiled, setting Lydia gently in her cradle before following him out into the cooling night. The moon hung low over the horizon, casting a silver glow over the valley. James took her hand, leading her toward the trail that wound down past the pastures, the same trail that had once led them to a hidden place filled with moonlight and wildflowers. As they walked, Clara felt her heart quicken, not with fear, but with that familiar sense of wonder that always seemed to follow wherever James led her. The air carried the scent of spring rain, and the cottonwood trees rustled like whispers. She looked up at him, her voice soft. "What is this all about?" He only smiled, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "You'll see soon enough. It's about remembering, about the day that changed everything." Clara's breath caught. Dust Creek? James nodded, his expression turning tender. It's been 1 year tomorrow since I saw you there, and I'm not about to let that day pass without honoring it. Her heart fluttered, emotion swelling thick in her chest. Whatever he had planned, she already knew. It would be something she'd remember for the rest of her life. What began in chains ends in grace, and in a love that built an entire world. The evening sky blazed with color, the kind of Texas sunset that seemed too perfect to belong to the mortal world. Gold bled into rose, rose into violet, and then into the kind of blue that could swallow every sorrow whole. The Callahan ranch lay bathed in the fading light, its fences casting long shadows across the greening fields. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, the scent of mesquite and bread drifting on the wind. Clara had spent the afternoon at the schoolhouse, grading arithmetic papers while Lydia napped in her cradle. When she stepped outside, the light had shifted, soft and honeyed, brushing the hills in gold. She started down the familiar trail toward home, her heart full in that quiet, heavy way joy sometimes comes. When she reached the gate, she noticed something strange. James's horse was tied up, but there was no sign of him near the house. The door was slightly ajar, and from inside came the faint sound of music. Curious, she pushed the door open. The sight that met her stole her breath. Their small kitchen had been transformed. Wildflowers filled every jar, pitcher, and teacup she owned. Bluebonnets, paintbrush, and yellow daisies glowing like pieces of the sunset itself. A white cloth covered the table, set neatly for two, and the fire burned low in the hearth. A pot of stew simmered, filling the air with warmth and rosemary. And there, standing beside the table with that familiar lopsided smile, was James. "Happy anniversary," he said softly. Clara stood frozen for a moment, laughter and tears colliding in her chest. "You remembered." "I'd have sooner forgotten my own name," he said. 1 year ago today I saw you in Dust Creek. 1 year since everything changed." He crossed the room and took her hands, his thumbs brushing the soft skin at her wrists. "That day broke something in me and fixed something else. I thought I was just saving a stranger. Turns out I was saving myself." Clara swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "James." He shook his head gently. "Don't say anything yet, just sit." She did, still half in disbelief, watching as he ladled stew into bowls with the care of a man handling something sacred. He'd even managed a loaf of bread, crooked, too dense by the look of it, but somehow perfect. When he set the bowl before her, she realized the little carving he'd made months ago, the wooden rose, was resting beside her plate. "I wanted tonight to be about remembering," he said, settling across from her. "Not the pain, but what came after. The building, the healing, the loving." Clara reached for his hand, her fingers tracing the lines of his palm. "It's strange," she said quietly. "Sometimes I still wake up expecting the sound of chains. I still see Dust Creek when I close my eyes. But then I look at you, at Lydia, at this life we've made, and I realize it wasn't the end. It was the beginning I didn't know I needed." He squeezed her hand. "The beginning of us." They ate slowly, talking and laughing. Between bites, James told stories of his early ranching mishaps, of the first time he tried to shoe a horse alone and nearly lost his hat, his pride, and a good pair of boots all in one go. Clara shared tales from the schoolhouse, her eyes sparkling as she described the children's latest attempt to help by painting the walls with ink instead of chalk. After supper, they carried their coffee out to the porch. The last of the daylight melted behind the hills, leaving a sky full of stars so bright it almost hurt to look at them. Lydia slept soundly inside. The faintest hum of her breathing carried through the open window. For a long time, they didn't speak. They simply sat together, James's arm around Clara's shoulders, her head resting against him, watching as the night claimed the land they had built from dust and devotion. Finally, James broke the silence. "You ever think about how far we've come?" "All the time," she said softly. "Sometimes I can hardly believe it's real." That the same woman who stood on that auction block now stands here, free, loved, and home. James looked out over the fields, the moonlight carving silver lines along his jaw. You made this place a home, Clara. You did that. I built the walls, but you filled them with life, with laughter, with meaning. She smiled faintly. We built it together. You taught me what love looks like when it's lived out loud, quiet, steady, real. He turned to her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You taught me what forgiveness feels like. For a moment neither spoke. The crickets filled the silence, and the air smelled faintly of sage. Clara's eyes shimmered as she looked at him, her heart swelling with all the words she couldn't say. You know, she began softly, I used to think my story ended that day in Dust Creek. I thought everything worth having had already been taken from me, but I was wrong. That was just the turning of the page. James smiled, his hand finding hers again. From a sack of grain to a life of gold, she finished, her voice trembling. They sat there beneath the Texas stars, letting the words hang between them, too sacred to disturb. The lamp inside the house flickered, its glow spilling out through the open door, painting them both in soft amber light. It made the scene feel timeless, as though they'd stepped out of the years and into something eternal. Clara leaned against him, her eyes drifting to the horizon. Do you think, she asked quietly, we were always meant to find each other? James thought for a moment. Maybe not meant to, he said, but ready to. The world put us where it did, and when the time came, we both stepped forward. That's what made the difference. She smiled. That sounds like something I'd tell my students, he chuckled. Guess you've been rubbing off on me. The wind stirred the wildflowers, their petals whispering against the grass. A coyote's distant call echoed across the valley, low and haunting, but somehow peaceful. Clara closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of James's hand, the rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palm. When she spoke again, her voice was softer than the breeze. This is what grace looks like. Not a miracle from heaven. Just two people choosing each other again and again, no matter how hard the world tries to break them. James kissed the top of her head. And that's all we'll ever have to do. The stars shimmered brighter, the night deepening around them. In the distance, the faint lights of Dust Creek glimmered, reminders of a life long left behind. Clara thought of the woman she'd once been, the one who had stood trembling and humiliated on an auction block. That woman was gone. In her place sat someone new, someone whole. From despair to joy, she murmured, her voice catching on the edge of a smile. From ending to beginning, this was our story. James tilted her chin toward him, his eyes reflecting starlight. And it's far from over. Clara smiled, tears glinting like glass in her lashes. No, she whispered. It's only just beginning. The wind sighed softly through the cottonwoods, carrying their laughter out across the land. Inside, the lamp burned low, its flame steady and golden, the light of a life built from ashes, from courage, from love. As the night settled in, Clara's voice lingered in the air, fading into the quiet hum of crickets and the soft rustle of wildflowers. And that, she whispered, her words dissolving into the night, was only the beginning. If Clara and James's journey from despair to grace touched your heart, don't ride off just yet. Hit that subscribe button to join me for more powerful Western tales of courage, redemption, and love born from hardship. Share this story with someone who believes that second chances can still bloom, even in the dust. And tell me in the comments, what moment in this story stayed with you the most? Because out here on the frontier of storytelling, every voice, every story, and every heart matters.